Right.
Okay, so today we have joining us Mr. Stephen Tuck from somewhere in Australia. Thank you, Stephen, for popping on. He's one of my Twitter followers, and he so kindly um allowed me to drag him into this. So, yeah, Stephen, you said that you are Catholic?
That's correct. Yes, yes.
Nice,
Uh,
nice, nice. I'm genuinely curious. Were you like raised Catholic?
no, I wasn't.
Oh.
The household I was born into, Dad was and is Catholic, although, well, was and is Catholic. Mum belonged to one of the Protestant churches out here which is known as the Uniting Church. um, which formed in the 70s from a merger of the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Congregationalists. So three rather smaller groups who found they had enough common ground to form a single organization. But to be perfectly honest, it was growing up for us. It was purely an Easter and Christmas kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think I have three sisters. The only one of us who was even baptized was my oldest sister, and that was because they weren't sure that she was going to survive as an infant. Um, Off the top of my head, I don't recall Kate, I think, was born a bit prematurely, and they
Mm.
weren't sure that she was going to make it. Anyway, so not a big part of my life growing up, but was always very, very interested in particularly the Catholic Church. I wrote about it. I did an honours year in history when I did my arts degree at Monash University, and wrote about a particular part of the theology of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a 12th century French saint.
Mm.
Um, so developed a great deal of interest. Then, when in the mid 2000s, I met a Catholic girl. It was particularly important to her, and that was enough of an incentive for me to go through the process of being accepted into that church. Uh, and honestly, I haven't regretted it. I mean, the marriage eventually bit the dust. These things happen, but uh, haven't regretted converting into it, uh, and have found an enormous amount of satisfaction in it. That's how I come to be where I am.
That's so cool. Yeah, I've quite a few people who've actually come into Catholicism like later in life. Like one of my close friends, he was an atheist and then he's really found a place in the Catholic Church. I think that he's close to, if not already is, a member of his church, which I think that's pretty cool. Yeah.
That there's you would say there's really something in it for anyone who wants to
Hmm.
find something in it. And what I mean by that is, if you're inclined to if a person's inclined to live out their faith through, say, service, community service, there's lots and lots of that there. If you find that faith is best expressed through ritual, through practice, through habit, it's there. If it's something where the things that are beautiful really speak to you, again, you can find it there. Not universally. I think everyone agrees that church architecture has really taken a bit of a nosedive since the 60s, but we'll just overlook the last few decades. But if you go and have a look at the cathedrals or the iconography, it's the phrase is always that things that should be done for the greater glory of God, and you will find that there. In my case, I get an enormous amount of satisfaction from knowing things and knowing how things are set out and can be understood in a clear and rational and logical fashion. And that's something that I find enormously rewarding, and that I think brings me closer to God. And you will find that there as well if that's how your faith speaks to you. Uh, so yeah, I could understand that someone might convert because they found something that they were looking for in it. That would what you say sounds very correct to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
I
I always personally have found that I felt the presence of God strongest in Catholic or Orthodox churches, strangely enough. I I myself was raised Catholic and I kind of moved away from that, but yeah, I I think that it's really cool seeing other people's perspectives on that religion.
that's good to hear, and it could well be that on your own particular. I really don't want to use the word journey. I really don't, but it's the only one that we sort of work here. Um,
Uh-huh.
you might find that at some point it brings you back into Catholicism or Orthodoxy, um, with what you've perhaps learned through roaming a bit further afield. Um,
Yeah, who knows?
that yes, that could well be. That could well be.
And I always find it interesting the orthodoxy like aspects of the more formal church because I don't know, something about it, just like the different holidays and the different like traditions that they have. Like, of course, growing up Catholic, Roman Catholic specifically,
Yes.
we didn't really have like the same traditions as, say, Greek Orthodox. So I think that that's always been kind of fascinating to me, seeing the comparisons and how they diverge and stuff. What specifically Catholicism are you?
Roman Catholic as well.
Cool, cool, cool.
So not one of the Eastern rites. No, no. So Roman Catholic.
Nice, nice. Who's your saint's name? What was your saint's name?
Celestin the Fifth. So he was one of the 13th century popes, if memory serves well. It does serve, and he. What I've always liked about him as a saint, essentially, is that he took everything back to the very basics. He was really never meant to be elected pope. He was a compromise candidate, in about 1250-ish.
Oh,
When he was a compromise candidate where the College of Cardinals had been deadlocked for about 8 months trying to appoint a successor to, I think, Boniface VIII. I'm subject to correction on who his successor was. And in the end, the people of Rome eventually dug their own heels in and refused to send any more food to the conclaved cardinals until they appointed someone. And eventually they said, well, there's a hermit who lives up in the mountains called Peter Moroni. Um, will he do? Because he at least had a good reputation for holiness. Fine. He accepted the appointment. It took the name of Pope Celestin V. It has to be said he wasn't a particularly successful pope. In fact, he was a bit of a disaster because he was a hermit and he had no experience managing people. He had no experience managing an organization, and he tended to be easily persuaded by whoever was the last voice that he heard because he wasn't particularly worldly. Um, Inevitably, um, uh, no, and I've misspoken before. His predecessor wasn't Boniface VIII. Boniface was his successor, who was a very, very different pope, and essentially far more a politician and power broker than a religious leader. Uh, he arrests Celestin allegedly, or perhaps not allegedly, for his own protection. Um, and he,
Protection from what?
I think really because it was a little bit like the church having a drunk driver at the wheel. Um, Granted, a drunk driver who had the best of motives and the best of intentions, but who was totally unsuited for the role that he was in. And eventually he had to be simply removed from office and put out of the way where he couldn't do any damage. um, uh, that happens. Anyway, what I've always liked about him, the reason I chose him as a confirmation saint, was the absolute humility that he took that with, of being removed from being the pontiff uh, to becoming a prisoner again. And it said that he would look about the cell that he was held in and say, well, all I wanted was a cell, and they've given me one. I've always liked that. I think that sort of humility and that knowledge that he only required one thing to be satisfied. There's something in that to admire. And yeah, that's always spoken to me. Who did you choose out of interest?
Yeah, Saint Bridget, the patron saint of charity. We were never really big into Catholicism, and at the time, charity was, and still is really, the biggest aspect of my faith, one of the biggest
Yeah.
aspects. And I kind of just Googled it, like whoever was the most charitable, like person who is known for it. And I liked the name Bridget, so that's
Yes,
what I
yeah.
chose.
Right. Okay. That's a perfectly good reason for choosing. I when I was going through the initiation for adults, the bishop who baptized me remarked that one of his duties would be to speak with primary school students who are coming up for confirmation, uh, and he would talk with each one of them about the saint that they'd chosen. He said in the age of Google, it was getting to be a real challenge for him because back in pre-internet days, all the boys would choose Patrick, Peter, George, things that were sort of well known. All the girls would choose
Mhm.
Mary, Teresa, St. Anne. Now he said kids would be coming in seeking as their confirmation saying people that he'd never heard of that he was having to really research.
Wow.
So Google has really added some to the experience of the church.
Definitely.
It's sort of striking what you say about orthodoxy. I must say I've never had a great knowledge of orthodoxy. I haven't avoided it. I just don't really know very much about it, and what I do know is much more limited to essentially political matters, particularly relating to Russian Orthodoxy, which is a bit of
Mm.
a unique beast. Uh, but I have very much thought that there's an enormous richness in what I have seen that
Yeah.
would be very rewarding for people, for anyone exploring it. A real richness and a real commitment to beauty.
That's interesting. What do you find beautiful about it?
Uh, the I've only been into a couple of Orthodox churches, both of them Greek. One in New Orleans, and I think I went into one in Australia at some here in Melbourne. Um, at some point. I couldn't even tell you for why. And what I was really struck by was the ornamentation and the amount of the determination to put things in their most beautiful form, with gold leaf, with decoration, uh, with icons, which Orthodoxy does particularly well. I'm sure that like a lot of things, there's all the world of difference between how how an Orthodox cathedral looks and how a parish church looks. I'm sure that's as different as it is for everybody. But what I've seen seems to show a real commitment to adding something to the glory of God. And that was always the point behind sacred architecture. That when one looked at something like, say, um, well, not the absolutely the archetype was Notre Dame in Paris, which I've never seen for real. I've only ever seen pictures of. It was meant to be a vision of heaven on earth.
Really?
Um, yeah, I think that was what drove it. What was the or it was either what drove it or what how people who saw it understood it. Certainly, from every time I've ever seen it seen pictures of it, it it really seemed to be almost an attempt to show well to depict heaven on earth. Um, One could say that the Orthodox churches that we were just talking about have a similar drive.
I can kind of see that. Yeah. How that kind of in a weird segue leads me to the question of how do you find it comforting or connecting to God in the rituals that you do in the Roman Catholic Church?
I think I think there are two things. One, at a purely historic level, the form that the Mass takes, the consecration of the Eucharist, the readings, and so on, the order of service has changed somewhat over the centuries, um, but it can be found going almost all the way back to, I think the first description of it is when is written down at or about the time that St. Peter and St. Paul are still alive. Um, I'm happy to be corrected on that point. I couldn't name the author who describes it in the very early church, but when you take part in that, you know that you're taking part in something which goes right back to the very founding of the church. The other thing, and this has particular meaning for me, lies in the understanding of the church as the body of Christ, as so something that encompasses all the faithful. Um, I after my marriage ended, the way it's ended basically is with my ex-wife and my two children living in the United States and me still living in Australia. That's been the case now for about 12 years. 12? 12, yeah. Um, yeah, it has been that long. Wow. Um, because every so often you just sort of the numbers add up in my head and I think, wow,
Yeah.
that's a while. Anyway, the reason I mention it is that when I'm in Melbourne, if I go to lunchtime mass at St. Francis's or any service, um, I know that I'm hearing the same service, the same critical elements that my daughters will hear later that same Sunday when the clock ticks, when the time difference ticks around. Um, I'm still quite, still on very good terms with the ex's family, and who are all very devout. Um, they and have always, viewed them with a lot of affection, and it means a lot to think, yep, I'm hearing the same service that they've heard, or that they're going to be hearing later today, and also hearing form of uh, the same form of worship that you know my father heard as a boy. Dad usually only goes to mass once a year at this point. That his mother heard. It makes you part of something much bigger, and something that in the end ties us back really to Jesus himself. Uh, so even though sometimes the other thing is that it's something that's always there. Um, when sometimes look, sometimes like all of us, you sort of come and go in how committed you are to things, and even if Sunday's rolled around and you're not feeling it, you don't particularly want to go to
Yeah.
church, but you have to, and you might be a bit hungover that morning. Um, you've gotten out of bed and you're still rubbing the sleep out of your eyes. The service is still there for you. And because you're reciting the same words that uh, yes, you might really not take in the readings, although usually you do. The homily might or might not sink in. Um, I think we've probably all had a few times sitting there through the homily, fighting to keep one's eyes open. But it is still there, and it's something that you can still be part of, even if for any number of reasons your heart's not actually in it. I think it's a little bit, you might say, like having a lifeline, where yes, okay, I'm not exactly here at 100%. Yes, I'm not 100% committed to it, but I'm here and I'm still part of what's going on around me. There's, I think there's real value in that. And, it's easy to admire, say, some of our Pentecostal friends, and who have this very energetic, very active, um, very emotional style of worship. That's terrific. And it would be, never having been to one of their services, I maybe miss doing them a disservice here. But it strikes me that if you're having one of those days where you're just not yourself and you're not thinking clearly, and hell, you don't want to be there particularly, um, I think that it would be a lot harder to take a good part of that act of worship without having to be fake in a sense. Which,
Hmm.
and that's not casting aspersions on anyone, of course, only that um, it's good to have something that you can cling on to, even when your heart's not in it, and still do your part of worshipping properly. That certainly appeals to me. Again, I'm sure other people would, probably experience things differently, but that's certainly how it appeals to me.
I think that that's r- I think that's really cool that that ritual and that homily help you engage with God authentically.
Yes. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. The idea of doing something authentically. That yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. I think that was the word I was trying to find. Yes, I think
Oh.
that's the concept that I was. That's the concept that I was
Mhm.
looking for.
How do you relate to God? Like, I mean, obviously it's you do how the rituals help you, of course, but how do you see God? Like more as father or more as God, like in the like Catholicism aspect?
Well, I'd answer for myself there because I think you'd get a range of answers, depending a little bit on who you spoke to and how their spirituality had been shaped. For me, however, it would be almost more as a wise and loving legislator. So someone who sets someone who sets rules which are set not simply for the sake of setting them and not for any tyrannical purpose, but for the sake of guiding the people in his care. So the rules are always the rules that he sets are based on love. And if one observes them, one will be living a life which is marked by love. Um, by way of example, um, uh, by way of example, the there are many verses in both the Old and New Testament about treating about how workers should be treated fairly. That has obvious resonance for me because my career for much of the last couple of decades has been as a workers' compensation lawyer, doing something different now. But that was what I started out my career as. I'm a lawyer by trade.
Oh,
Um, so the the instruction that someone shouldn't cheat their workers, shouldn't deprive them of wages that they've earned. Um, that that sort of guidance, if someone's behaving, if someone is, say, was to live their life and organize their work relationships around that principle that work shouldn't be made unbearable, that wages should be paid when they've been properly earned. And the flip side, and you see this in memory serves the parable of the servants in the vineyard, um, that workers should be content with the conditions that they've voluntarily taken on. Um, you'd remember the master of the vineyard hires workers for the day and agrees to pay them, call it 6 denarii, for a day's hot work. And then later in the day, at lunchtime, he brings in more and says, well, you'll be paid 6 denarii for your work. And then right on sunset, he goes and hires still more laborers for six
yeah.
denarii a day. And the first lot of workers say, come on, this isn't really right. We've been out here all, sweating it out all day. Why are they being paid the same as us? And the master says, quite properly, um, what's it to you? Essentially, you've taken on the work. What's it to you if I'm generous with my money? Now, there's obviously a, a parable there about how God will treat his servants, depending really on whether you've been numbered among them from the day you were born, or whether you've only converted on your deathbed. Um, but even at its fundament there's still guidance as to how one should live one's life. You could multiply the examples. There are similar things to do with how families should behave, how spouses should behave to one another, um, how people should act towards their friends, and certainly how they should act towards their enemies. And let's face it, that last one is it's been said, hasn't it, that you can condense the whole of the law down to two things, love God and love your neighbor. And it's the second of those that most of us never really completely accomplish. Uh, We're the first to admit that.
Yeah.
Um, I think most, and if you don't believe me, go to a traffic jam any day of the week. Um,
Traffic.
yeah, it's been said, no, there is nowhere in the world more unforgiving and merciless than a church car park after service lets out on Sunday. It's like Mad Max, you know. Um, sorry, just to finish the thought off. There's all of that guidance, even to touch the hottest of the hot button issues. Um, uh, uh, the the laws that God has given regarding things like abortion, sexuality, and so on. Even if one even if one doesn't accept them or can't live one's life consistently with them, uh, I think a person would have to still look at them, and if they're approaching it all from a position of goodwill, I think would say, okay, I accept that these are rules which have been given for my benefit and not simply because of a wish to treat people harshly or unjustly. Yes, things can, obviously with those issues particularly because they touch it so much at the heart of human experience.
Yeah.
It's very easy to see, it doesn't take any imagination uh, to see why someone may say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I do not agree, and I choose not to, and I won't act consistently with what God has said. It's easy to understand why someone would say that, but I think if such a person is coming from a position of goodwill, they'd say, okay, I accept that this that these rules on behavior aren't in place maliciously or malevolently. I think you can really take that through pretty much all Christian behavior. And for that matter, although I haven't given this any great thought, probably the thinking of most religions from the tribal and animist beliefs of societies like well, indigenous societies, all the way through to Shintoism and the faiths of East Asia.
Yeah. It sounds like you kind of studied a little bit.
Read a bit and I suppose try and be one tries to be a little you try and be a little bit broad-minded. Um, uh, Something I've always really liked was there's an encyclical that Pope Paul VI released in the late 70s called Evangelii Nuntiandi, uh, which uh, said, one must not disparage um, the other faiths by which other people live their lives, because even if you don't accept their premises or the outcomes, these are still people who have their arms stretched out towards heaven. I've always very much liked that image and thought, yeah, one has to at least give someone the credit for that, even if you can't find much more common ground than that. That there are still many things that one can uh, learn from other faiths, and certainly in almost all cases they should be treated uh, with essential respect.
It sounds very Pauline. I
I would never thought of it that way.
I mean when you say that, all I can think of is how Paul famously was living it in Greece. I think it was Greece. Being a tent maker, all that jazz. And he was like kind of studying. I'm not going to say studying, but like
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes, yeah.
observing their religions and how many gods they had, and that they had this one specific temple for any god that they may not know about or forgotten. And I don't know if it was specifically in his letter, but I feel like he must have talked about it like to them specifically. Because he was like, the one that you forgot was, Jesus, but
That,
that's
that's an
the vibe
interesting
that
thought.
I
I'd never
get.
thought of that before. That's a very
Really
good point. No, I'd really never thought of that before.
interesting. That's like central to like how I relate to other religions.
Yeah, I, I hadn't put those two pieces together, which
Nice.
is sort of a good thing in a way. We've sort of approached it through very different sources of authority and reached the same conclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is. I must say though, this is. I think probably a lot of people have this issue with Paul. I sometimes think that just as a person, he seems like he would have been really hard to get on with.
Oh my God. Even Peter thought
One of these people
so.
who always would have had to have the last word.
If he ever stopped talking at all. And then Peter going, you know what? If you really thought about what he was saying, you could understand it, but no one understands him. Part of me thinks that that's just because he doesn't give you the chance to.
You can't get a word in edgeways.
Just keeps going around in his own mind. Well, speaking of going around, I want to respect your time. You said that you had
Sure.
about an hour, and it's
Yeah,
been about an hour.
no
So,
problems at all.
do you have any last thoughts, remarks, comments that you'd like to tell us?
Look, not especially, but I've really enjoyed the conversation this afternoon, and we'll really look forward to seeing other interviewees who pop up on your channel. I'd very much be looking forward to that.
Definitely. And I will let you know when this is live, and I'll put it on a Twitter post and tag you like I did the
Terrific.
previous weeks. Thank you so much for
I'd
agreeing
like
to
that.
come
Yeah.
on.
No problems at all. Not a problem at all.
You have a blessed rest of your weekday.
No problems at all. I don't know whether you're about to stop the recording or whether I just leave now. Sorry, I